Right, welcome back. Looks like the listeners have thrown us a real curveball this time.
Oh, so.
Well, they've sent in a whole stack of articles about Trump, him being back in the White House and what
Yeah.
it could all mean for the economy. Especially, they're curious about what this means for the Federal Reserve.
So we're talking about a potential economic showdown then.
Exactly. And the listener wants to know if it's time to, batten down the hatches or break out the champagne.
Well, if we're talking about champagne, it seems like the market's already celebrating. Right after the election, the Dow had its biggest jump since 1896.
Wow, really?
Biggest post-election leap in history. And tons of S&P 500 stocks are having new highs, too.
Huh. So at first glance, it looks like everyone's breathing a sigh of relief. Like, phew, at least we know it's happening now.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of that. Markets, they often like a clear outcome. They crave that sense of certainty.
But reading through these articles, some of them are suggesting that this might just be a temporary thing, like a sugar rush, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. You get that initial euphoria, but it can fade pretty quickly.
Right.
In the long run, it's the policies that really matter, not just, the personalities involved.
And speaking of personalities, well, Trump's back.
Yes.
And he's never exactly been shy about sharing his, shall we say, opinions about how the Fed should be doing things.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah, and one article even quotes him saying that Powell, the Fed chair, that he only stays on
Right.
if I thought he was doing the right thing.
Yeah, not exactly a vote of confidence there, is it?
Not really. So I'm kind of getting nervous now. We've got Trump, who likes to be in control,
Yes.
and then you've got Powell, whose whole job is to make sure the Fed stays independent.
Right, making decisions based on what the data's saying, not on politics.
Exactly. So this could turn into like a real tug of war, couldn't it?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And it's a tug of war with some pretty high stakes.
I'm picturing like this epic arm wrestle, but instead of muscles, it's interest rates and tariffs.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, if Trump really pushes for things that the Fed sees as risky,
Okay, like what?
well, certain types of tax cuts or spending, for example,
Right.
that's when things could get, well, messy. Public disagreements between the president and the Fed.
I could see how that wouldn't be good.
Yeah, it erodes confidence, makes the market super jittery. It's almost like watching your parents fight about money,
Yeah, bro.
Not very reassuring.
Definitely makes you want to check your own bank account. So let's talk about these potentially risky policies.
Sure.
The articles are laying out some of Trump's big economic plans. We're talking tariffs on imports, especially from China, those tax cuts we just mentioned, and then maybe even cutting back on some government spending, too.
Yeah, and that's the combination that's making a lot of economists nervous about inflation.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about it this way. Those tariffs, they make imported goods more expensive.
Oh, right.
You end up paying more for everything, your electronics, your clothes, everything.
So you're saying it hits consumers directly?
Absolutely. And then those tax cuts, well, they can be great in some ways,
Yeah.
but they also mean people suddenly have more cash in their pockets to spend. And when everyone's out there spending more, well, that can push prices up even higher.
So it's like a double whammy on prices then.
Exactly. And the articles are quoting some pretty scary numbers here. We're potentially talking about a 60% tariff on Chinese goods, 10% on others.
60%. Wow. I'd be checking those made-in labels like crazy.
You and everyone else. And JP Morgan, they're predicting that those tariffs combined with the tax cuts could push inflation up by a whole 2.5 percentage points.
So not just a small jump, but a real bite.
Exactly.
But wait, hold on. Isn't the Fed supposed to, keep inflation under control? Isn't that their whole thing?
It is. That's a big part of what they do. It's part of what they call their dual mandate. Keep inflation in check.
Right.
And also try to keep unemployment low. Two really important goals, but they often kind of pull in opposite directions.
So they're like the ultimate juggler, trying to keep all these balls in the air at the same time, except the balls are like the entire U.S. economy.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where it gets really, really tricky. Because with Trump's policies, it's kind of like he's throwing a bunch of extra flaming balls into the mix.
Flaming balls. Okay, now I'm really scared.
Well, figuratively speaking.
Yeah.
But the point is, if inflation starts heating up, the Fed's natural instinct is to raise interest rates.
Right, to cool things down.
Exactly. But raising rates can also slow down the economy, which could end up hurting jobs. It's a real tightrope walk.
So what's the market saying about all this? Are they freaking out?
Well, Right after the election, there was actually this interesting shift. Some traders actually scaled back their bets on a December rate cut.
Wait, really? Even though Trump wouldn't even be in office yet?
Yeah, it was a bit surprising, but at the same time, bond yields started creeping up, and that's usually a sign that people are worried about inflation.
Hold on, bond yields. Now, you know I try to keep up with this stuff, but
Yeah, can get a little jargony.
yeah. Can we, break that down a bit for our listeners?
Sure. Think of it like this. You lend some money to the government, that's a bond. And the yield. That's basically the interest they pay you back.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
Now, when people start getting worried that inflation is going to eat away at their returns,
Right.
they start demanding higher yields. They're basically saying, hey, if my money is going to be worth less tomorrow,
Uh-huh.
I want a bigger return today.
That makes sense. So what you're saying is those bond yields going up,
Right.
that could actually trickle down and affect things like mortgages and car loans.
It often does. It can make them more expensive for everyone.
So this whole tug of war between Trump and the Fed,
Yeah.
it could end up hitting us all right in the wallet, even if we're not Wall Street traders and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. It's all connected in the end. And that actually brings us to another big piece of the puzzle that these articles are highlighting, the national debt. It's a big one.
Yeah, the articles are throwing around this number,
Yeah.
$36 trillion. I don't even know what to say to that.
It's a lot of zeros, that's for sure.
It is. And then we were just talking about Trump's tax cuts.
Right.
Don't those usually mean less money coming into the government?
Well, that's often the trade-off, yeah. Tax cuts can be a good thing in some ways. It can be like giving the economy a little shot of espresso, gets things moving a bit faster in the short term.
Okay, so quick boost.
Exactly. But like that espresso, it can also leave you with a bit of a crash later on.
Oh, right.
Because if there's less tax revenue coming in, it means the government has less money to work with. And if they don't cut spending to make up for it, well, that debt just keeps piling up.
So it's kind of like maxing out your credit card to throw a big party.
Ooh, that's a good analogy.
Fun at the time, but eventually those bills are going to show up in your mailbox.
They always do. And that's what puts the Fed in this really tough spot.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, do they try to keep interest rates low, to help the government deal with all that debt? Or do they have to raise them to fight inflation, even if it means those debt payments get even bigger?
Ugh, that sounds like a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, it's a tricky balancing act for sure. And here's the thing. These articles, they're mainly focused on the U.S.
Right.
But we're not living in a vacuum here. We're part of a global economy. What happens in other countries, it can have a ripple effect right back here at home.
One article mentioned how different the world is now compared to, Trump's first term.
Oh, absolutely. Things have changed so much.
We've got those supply chain issues.
Mm-hmm.
Europe's still dealing with that energy crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And the war in Ukraine is still messing things up all over the place.
It's a whole different ballgame now. And it means that the Fed can't just focus on what's happening here in the U.S. They have to be watching the whole global scene, too.
So what are some of the big things they're keeping an eye on?
Well, for one thing, if other countries are having their own struggles with inflation and they start raising their interest rates, well, that could put pressure on the Fed to do the same, even if things aren't quite that bad here.
So it's like a global game of keep up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you've got these wild cards, these big geopolitical events, like the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's definitely a wild card.
It's already had a huge impact on energy markets, on global trade. Any escalation there, or even new conflicts popping up, that could really throw a wrench into the Fed's plans.
So it's not just Trump versus the Fed then. It's like the whole world is in on this tug of war.
That's a great way to put it. It's this incredibly complex web with all these different forces pushing and pulling on each other, and the Fed is right in the middle of it all, trying to keep things balanced.
I don't envy them. It's like, remember those flaming bowling pins we were talking about earlier?
Ha-ha!
It's like they're juggling those, but now they're juggling on a unicycle, on a tightrope, in the middle of a hurricane.
That's a pretty vivid image. But hey, it's not all doom and gloom. Remember, the Fed has a pretty good track record. They've been through some tough times before, and they've managed to navigate them.
Okay, so they've got a few tricks up their sleeves.
I wouldn't say tricks exactly, but they do have a lot of tools at their disposal. And they've shown that they're willing to adapt, to change their approach when they need to.
So it's not necessarily panic time.
No.
But maybe more like, okay, buckle up. It's going to be a bumpy ride.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
And what's the best way to navigate this bumpy ride?
Well, I'd say stay informed, think critically, and don't be afraid to ask questions, just like you're doing right now.
Asking good questions is what keeps us all on our toes. But before we go, I'm curious, is there, like, one big thing our listeners should be watching out for in the next few months?
Yeah, that's a good question. For me, it's how this whole Trump-Fed dynamic plays out on the world stage. These articles, they're very U.S.-centric.
Right.
But what happens if, say, China's economy starts slowing down? Or if Europe gets hit with another energy crisis? How does all that ripple back and impact what the Fed can do here?
Oh, that's interesting. It's like those butterfly effect diagrams, right?
Exactly.
One little flap of a wing in China could end up causing a whole economic hurricane over here.
Exactly. And it's not just the purely economic stuff either.
What else then?
Think about political instability, trade wars, even climate change and the disasters that come with that. Those can all send shockwaves through the global economy. So yeah, I'd say keep an eye on those international headlines.
Okay.
They might actually give you a little preview of what the Fed might do next.
All right, so let's do a quick recap for our listener. We've got this potential power struggle between Trump and the Fed, policies that could really send inflation soaring, this mountain of national debt, and a global economy that feels like it's, strapped onto a rocket.
It's definitely a lot to take in.
It is. So what's the bottom line here? Why should our listener care about all of this?
Well, to put it simply, I think it's time to buckle up for some potential economic turbulence. We could see interest rates going up and down, the stock market doing its usual crazy dance, and maybe even prices on everyday things getting a little unpredictable. It's a good time to stay informed and maybe, hold on to your wallet a little tighter.
So not full-on panic mode, but definitely eyes wide open.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, especially when the economy's doing its unpredictable dance.
Couldn't agree more. Well, dear listener, I hope you've enjoyed this little adventure through the possible economic twists and turns that Trump's return might bring. It's a lot to think about, but hopefully you're feeling a little more prepared now. And hey, maybe even a little excited to see how it all unfolds. It's definitely going to be interesting.
A little economic drama always keeps things spicy.
It does. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive. Remember, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of economics.
See you then.